when 38-year-old Miles Harrigan didn't come back from what should have been a routine 3-day black bear hunt in the deep wilderness outside Port Angeles, Washington, Elena Harrigan felt it in her body before her mind would accept it. Miles was a man built from patterns, not rituals for the sake of superstition, practical habits that kept him safe and made life predictable. He checked the weather twice. He wrote down routes. He texted when he said he would. He never let the gas tank drop below half. He paid bills early, sharpened knives on the same stone, and returned every borrowed tool cleaner than when he'd taken it. People teased him about it. He smiled, shrugged, and kept doing things the same way anyway. That was why the silence was so loud. Port Angeles was a working town pressed between water and mountains, where the Strait of Juan de Fuca opened westward into the Pacific, and the Olympics rose up behind the neighborhoods like a shadow made of stone. The timberline began close, and the rainforests of the peninsula, thick with hemlock, cedar, and spruce, stayed wet enough that even in summer, the world felt rinsed clean. In the fall, mist crawled through the streets, and the forest smelled like cold earth and iron. Miles belonged to that place. He'd been raised in a little cluster of houses outside town, where the roads turned to gravel and moss crept up porch steps. His father had worked the water, hauling nets and crab pots long before tourism and ferry traffic made the waterfront feel polished. Miles grew up watching men come back exhausted and satisfied, hands split by rope burn, faces salted by spray. By the time he was 15, he could work a deck without being told where to stand. By 20, he could take an engine apart, set it on an old tarp, and rebuild it with a calm focus that made onlookers feel clumsy. In the summer, he ran commercial trips with a small crew, long hours, tight margins, cold mornings when your breath felt like smoke on the skin. In autumn, when the boats came in and the work slowed, he went into the woods. He didn't hunt to prove anything. He didn't talk about it online or pose with dead animals. He hunted because it gave him space to breathe. The forest wasn't a weekend escape. It was, in his own quiet way, a kind of home, an older, harsher one with its own rules. He respected those rules. He'd been lecturing friends for years about not pushing late in bad weather, about carrying redundancy, about staying humble when you were miles from help. And yet, humility didn't stop accidents from happening. Elena knew that. She'd learned to live with the risks, the way fishermen's spouses learn to live with storms. Fear was always there, but you learned to fold it into your days, so it didn't make you brittle. Elena met Miles in her mid-20s while she was finishing a degree in education and working evenings at a cafe near the ferry terminal. He'd come in muddy and rain-soaked after a day repairing a friend's outboard, and ordered soup like he was too cold for small talk. He had the kind of face that looked serious until he smiled, which was rarely, and then, suddenly, all at once. He asked her out without swagger. He simply asked, like it was reasonable to want someone's company. They married a few years later and bought a small house on the edge of town with a yard backed up against a wall of green. In summer, Elena planted tomatoes and herbs in raised beds. In fall, the deer came down to chew the last sweet leaves. Sometimes black bears wandered by at dusk, quiet as shadows, and Miles would stand on the porch and watch them with a mixture of caution and admiration. The year before he disappeared, Miles had taken a hard fall, crossing a slick log over a creek. Nothing dramatic. A foot slipped, his weight shifted wrong, and he came down on his side. He hobbled back to his truck on a half-torn ankle, teeth clenched. When Elena saw the swelling, she felt something inside her turn cold. That night, she told him she wanted him carrying a satellite messenger every time he went deep. He tried to argue the cost and the annoyance. Elena didn't argue back. She said, "I'm not asking." Something in her tone shut the discussion down. A week later, the device arrived, and Miles clipped it to his pack like a new habit. On the morning of October 15th, 2013, the air had that early winter edge that made every sound sharper. A pale dusting of snow sat on the highest ridges, and the clouds were low enough to feel like they were resting on the treetops. Miles moved through the house quietly, already in the mindset that hunting days required. Attentive, economical, leaving no loose ends. He packed as he always did, methodical, unhurried. His rifle case went to the back seat. Packs and food went behind it. Small tools and a first aid kit slid into their usual pockets. He checked batteries. He checked matches. He checked the waterproof pouch where he kept a paper map and a small notebook. Elena watched him from the doorway, coffee warming her hands, and tried to make her face neutral. She'd learned over the years that sending him out with fear in her eyes didn't keep him safer. It only made leaving harder. He kissed her at the porch step and said he'd be back Sunday. No later than dinner, he promised. If you're late, you ping, she said. I'll ping, he agreed. And she saw, just for a second, how much it mattered to him that she could trust those words. His plan was simple and conservative. He intended to drive a rough service road that cut into the western edge of Olympic National Forest, park when the road became too ugly, and hike into a set of berry-rich draws he'd hunted before. Bears were feeding hard in October, turning their attention to anything that offered calories: berry patches, salmon runs, windfall fruit. Miles liked the valleys where a creek braided through alders, and the hillside held clusters of late berries. He'd taken 2 bears there across the years, always careful about wind and always careful about shot placement. He wasn't going far by Alaska standards, but on the Peninsula, 15 miles from pavement could be a different planet. The forest there was dense enough to muffle voices. The understory grabbed at clothing. The terrain folded into ravines and ridgelines that looked small on a map and felt endless on your knees. Elena stood on the porch and watched his truck drift down the gravel as if it were a boat slipping into fog. Tail lights dimmed and disappeared. The quiet that followed wasn't unusual. The different thing was the way it pressed on her ribs. She spent that weekend trying to keep herself busy. She cleaned the mudroom, organized the pantry, and folded laundry even though it didn't need folding yet. She weeded the garden and set a fresh stack of firewood by the door so Miles wouldn't have to do it later. On Saturday, she caught herself listening for his satellite ping, as if it might arrive early. It didn't. Sunday afternoon, she started the stew he loved: beef, potatoes, onions, thyme from the garden. The smell filled the house and made it feel as though he might walk in any second, shaking rain from his jacket. By Sunday evening, darkness settled over the yard, and the driveway stayed empty. Elena checked the road through the window. So many times she felt embarrassed by the repetition, as if her fear were something childish. She told herself that hunters ran late. Miles could take an extra ridge. He could get slowed by brush. He could decide to camp another night and come in Monday. But Miles didn't do unannounced extensions. That was the thing. It wasn't that he never ran late. It was that he never failed to communicate. Pattern, habit, reliability. His small daily proofs of love. When Monday morning came, her worry hardened into something more direct. She called Caleb Mercer, one of the few friends Miles would occasionally hunt with. Caleb sounded genuinely surprised. He didn't mention a trip, Caleb said. I haven't heard from him at all. Elena called another friend, then another. No one knew he'd gone out. That wasn't conclusive, but it turned her unease into alarm because it meant something else. He'd kept this one quiet. Not secretive, just quiet. Maybe because he'd planned it as a short reset, the way some people took a drive to clear their head. Maybe he'd simply assumed it was ordinary and didn't need mentioning. Elena dialed the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. The deputy she spoke to, Aaron Weller, had a voice that carried both patience and the careful distance of experience. He asked questions, then asked them again in slightly different ways, trying to catch details Elena hadn't realized mattered. The exact time Miles left, the direction he drove, the type of truck, which road, whether he carried medication, whether he'd ever had issues with alcohol, whether he'd spoken strangely before leaving. She answered steadily, her hands cold despite the heater. When she mentioned the satellite communicator, Weller paused. "Has he used it before?" he asked. "Once," Elena said. "To tell me he'd changed his camp spot. Just a quick check-in." "And no signal now?" "Nothing." "All right," Weller said, and she heard the shift in him the moment it stopped being routine. The missing person report was filed. Weller told her that in many cases, overdue hunters turned up within a day. A broken axle, a flooded creek, a twisted knee. But he didn't smooth it over with false comfort. He told her the weather forecast was moving toward a storm and that early action mattered. By Tuesday morning, the case escalated to search and rescue coordination. Lieutenant Mark Klein, a veteran SAR leader who'd worked the Olympics for years, took charge of the organized response. Klein had the kind of competence that made people feel calmer just by standing near him. He didn't talk about worst-case scenarios in hushed tones. He talked about tasks. He set a command point at a small county facility and also established a communication link with Elena at her house, since she was the one who could answer questions about Miles's habits and preferences. Elena began keeping her own log, writing down names and times, copying maps, trying to make the chaos feel like something with edges. The first step was obvious. Find Miles's truck. A team of volunteers and deputies drove the service road into the forest. The road was more suggestion than surface, collapsing into ruts, slick with rain and pine needles. After several miles, one of the vehicles had to stop. Another made it farther. Finally, near a bend where the canopy grew tight overhead, they found it. Miles's pickup sat off to the side, as if he'd parked with care. The doors were unlocked. Nothing looked smashed or stolen. The cab smelled faintly of old coffee and wet wool. His pack was gone. His rifle case was gone. Food and gear were gone. He had walked in. Fresh tire tracks said the truck had arrived when Elena said it had. There were no other tracks close enough to suggest someone had followed him and made trouble. There were no signs of a struggle. In a way, that was the most frightening thing. A truck left behind like a punctuation mark at the edge of a sentence. Searchers fanned out from the road. The Olympic rainforest was both beautiful and hostile in its own quiet way. Ferns grew waist-high. Downed logs lay slick with moss. Vine, maple, and salal formed thickets that could turn 100 yards into an hour. The ground was uneven enough to roll an ankle without warning. Every creek, even a small one, could become a problem if rain hit hard. They moved in lines when they could, called Miles's name, and listened for an answer that never came. They looked for sign, boot prints in soft mud, snapped twigs that were too fresh to be animal, bits of tape, a scrap of wrapper, anything out of place. Rain made tracking nearly impossible. It blurred prints. It washed away the small, sharp details that told an experienced eye what direction someone had gone. A helicopter was requested. When the weather cleared enough, it came in low over the canopy, the roar of rotors shoving trees around, as if the forest were bending away. Pilots and observers scanned for unnatural shapes or colors. But from above, an Olympic forest is a solid green rug. Even with modern optics, a person beneath it can vanish. The helicopter helped anyway. It transported teams to remote points faster than feet could. It allowed searching along ridges and valleys that would have taken hours to reach. Still, the essential work finding a missing man was done close to the ground. As days passed, the search expanded. They checked creek beds and ravines. They looked along animal corridors because lost people often follow game trails, and hunters often do the same when tracking sign. They checked likely camp clearings. They spoke with locals, other hunters, hikers, mushroom pickers, asking whether anyone had seen Miles or his truck. Nothing. Elena stayed at her house, refusing to leave because she believed that if Miles did manage to come out on his own, he would come straight there. Friends took turns sitting with her. They brought food and quiet conversation. They offered practical help, like driving water and snacks to the search command in case volunteers needed them. Elena accepted help the way someone accepts a blanket in cold weather, grateful without having the space to express it. At night, she slept in short bursts, waking to check her phone and then staring at it like she could will it to vibrate. Every day brought its own cycle of hope and dread. Morning meant teams would go back out. Afternoon meant updates. Evening meant the slow suspicion that if they hadn't found anything by now, they might not find anything today. And then morning again. Ranger Owen Pierce, a Forest Service ranger who knew the area as well as anyone, joined the operation and warned them about hidden hazards the maps didn't show. The peninsula had old culverts and broken drainage pipes left from logging days. It had steep slips and rotten root systems that could drop a person into a hole they never saw coming. It had narrow ravines so thick with ferns that you could walk into them and disappear from view 15 feet away. Pierce guided searchers to the most dangerous spots, first places where rookie hikers had been injured in the past, places where a fall could be fatal. They searched them carefully. Still nothing. In town, people began to talk in that anxious, circular way communities do when a story stays unresolved. At the waterfront, deckhands and shop owners traded theories like they were handling something sharp. Someone said a bear could have dragged him off. Someone else insisted Miles was too smart for that. Someone suggested Miles might have run into people dumping waste. Someone suggested he'd gotten turned around in fog and walked the wrong drainage. The thing everyone returned to again and again was the satellite device. If it worked, why hadn't he used it? Deputy Weller checked with the satellite company, and the response was maddening. No distress signal from Miles's unit had been received. The device hadn't pinged. It hadn't transmitted. It was as if it had never existed. Klein's teams expanded the grid beyond the assumed hunting area, but the peninsula was enormous, and the forest had countless compartments. In each valley and bowl, the canopy stitched itself overhead. Moving a search line through that kind of terrain was like trying to comb through a flooded field with a fork. The weather worsened. Freezing rain hit higher elevations, and wet snow began to stick to branches. It wasn't yet deep winter, but it was enough to increase risk. Mornings started with frost. Night temperatures dropped low enough to make hypothermia a constant threat for anyone stranded. Klein had to consider the safety of the searchers. Every day the chance of rescuing Miles alive decreased, and the chance of injuring a volunteer increased. This was the cruel math of wilderness searches. The longer you go, the harder the terrain feels, and the more danger spreads outward to everyone trying to help. On November 8, 2013, after weeks of organized searching without a single solid clue, Klein made the decision to scale back and conclude the official operation. It was not announced as, "We're giving up," but that was how it felt to the people who had been walking the ravines, calling into the trees, and returning with blistered feet and empty hands. The case shifted from active rescue to missing person investigation. Paperwork changed, responsibilities shifted, and the energy in town turned from frantic to grieving. Elena didn't accept it as final. Not then. Through the winter, whenever weather allowed, she hired guides and walked the same corridor searchers had walked. She studied the maps so often she could trace the ridges from memory. She learned the names of drainages and creeks she'd never heard of before. She read survival manuals late at night, as if study could replace the missing years. Sometimes in the half-lit mornings when the world was quiet, she would imagine Miles hunkered under a tarp somewhere, rationing food, waiting for the storm to break. The image was both comforting and unbearable. Detective Grant Holloway, assigned to the ongoing investigation, did what investigators do in cases where a person vanishes without obvious signs. He followed the threads of Miles's life, looking for any hint that the wilderness wasn't the whole story. Holloway interviewed friends, co-workers, and neighbors. He checked financial records. He asked about arguments, affairs, debts, anything that could suggest Miles might have left intentionally. He found nothing. Miles's life was ordinary in the best way. Steady work, quiet routines, a marriage that everyone described as solid. If Miles had been hiding something, he'd hidden it well enough to leave no shadow. Holloway returned repeatedly to the basic truth. Miles went hunting, and something stopped him from returning. As 2014 turned into 2015, Elena began to live in a strange in-between state. She could not fully mourn, because in her mind, mourning required a body, a marker, something the hands could touch. But she could not fully hope either, because hope without evidence felt like gasping in thin air. Friends urged her to see a counselor, and for a while she did. The counselor didn't offer a miracle. She offered language for the limbo Elena was living in. Closure, she said, didn't always arrive as a clean event. Sometimes it arrived in pieces, and sometimes it never felt complete. The town's hunting culture shifted after Miles. Men who used to go out solo began pairing up. People invested in better emergency beacons. A local outdoor shop started offering discounted wilderness safety courses and focused heavily on redundancy. 2 fire starters, 2 ways to purify water, 2 ways to communicate. It was a small tribute, though no one said it that way aloud. In spring 2016, Elena held a memorial service without a body to bury. It took place in a small church on the edge of town, simple wooden pews, faint smell of old hymnals, rain tapping the windows. People packed the place, deckhands in clean jeans, Forest Service workers in faded green, hunters in jackets that still smelled faintly of smoke. They told stories. They talked about Miles teaching a teenager how to tie knots without making him feel stupid. They talked about him staying late after a long shift to help someone fix a fuel line. They talked about the way he treated the forest, like it was not an enemy to conquer, but something to move through carefully. The service offered a kind of shared grief, but it didn't answer the question that haunted Elena at night. Where? Where had he gone? Where had he fallen? Where had he spent his last hours? In early 2017, Holloway retired, and Miles's case file went to Detective Mariah Quinn. Quinn brought fresh eyes and an unfamiliarity that was, surprisingly, an advantage. She didn't carry the same assumptions about where Miles should have been. She reviewed every map, every search report, and every note about weather patterns and volunteer routes. The work had been thorough. It had also been limited by what all wilderness searches are limited by, the impossible scale of the environment. Quinn kept the file active, instructing patrol officers and rangers to report any discovery old gear, bones, anything out of place during their regular work. Most cold cases don't break because a detective has a brilliant epiphany. They break because time loosens the earth and someone stumbles on what was hidden. The person who stumbled on it in Miles's case wasn't a hunter or a ranger. He was a photographer. Noah Keating was a freelance wildlife photographer from Montana who came to the Olympic Peninsula in early summer 2017 to work on a magazine feature about predator movement. Wolves had long been absent from much of the region, and recent reports suggested small packs might be moving through remote corridors. Keating wanted images, real ones, not blurry trail cam shots. He planned his work the way a careful hunter plans a trip: redundancies, routes, check-ins. He carried a satellite communicator and a GPS. He kept food sealed and hung it high. He moved slowly because the forest rewarded patience and punished noise. His assignment drew him into areas that saw humans rarely. He spent days circling drainages, setting up in observation points, and waiting in stillness so complete he could hear the wet plop of needles dropping to the ground. On June 23, 2017, Keating followed a faint game trail through a dense corridor between two ridges, a natural funnel where predators often moved. He was checking his GPS when a flash of unnatural color caught his eye. It was partially hidden under a fallen spruce and buried under years of debris. Something bright, faded, wrong. At first he assumed it was old nylon, a lost tarp, an abandoned jacket. He stepped closer. His stomach dropped. The color was screaming orange fabric shredded and clinging to bone. The bones belonged to a human. The remains were scattered over an area roughly the size of a small living room, moved by scavengers over years. Some larger bones still lay near each other. Smaller ones had been dragged off. The skull sat crooked under the edge of the downed tree, and even through weathering, there was damage that looked like more than time. Keating backed away carefully, fighting a wave of nausea that threatened to fold him to the ground. He forced himself not to touch anything, not even the fabric, and he reached for his satellite device with fingers that kept misfiring. The emergency call went to dispatch. The dispatcher, Tessa Lang, kept her tone steady, asked for coordinates, and instructed Keating to move to a safe distance and wait. She warned him not to disturb the site and to remain alert for bears, because the presence of remains, even old ones, could draw scavengers and predators. Within minutes, the call reached Sergeant Ryan Holbrook, a wilderness response officer with a military police background. Holbrook assembled a team. Detective Quinn, a forensic expert named Dr. Serena Blake, and a small group trained in backcountry recovery. A helicopter was requested, and the pilot, Captain Joel Ramirez, arranged a flight path that would take them over miles of unbroken forest. The flight emphasized the central reality of the case. From above, the peninsula looked endless. There were no fences, no obvious landmarks, no neat grid of civilization. Just green, ridges, and water, folding into the distance. They landed in a small clearing half a mile from Keating's coordinates and pushed through thick undergrowth on foot. Keating had marked the route with bright tape. Even with that help, progress was slow. The forest resisted movement. Branches snapped. Ferns slapped against legs. The ground rolled and dipped unexpectedly, and the air smelled of wet bark and cold soil. At the scene, Dr. Blake took over with the calm of someone trained to treat horror as a puzzle. She photographed everything before collecting it. She noted bone positions, the direction of scatter, the condition of fabric. She identified signs of scavenging. She also identified trauma that suggested an initial violent event. The recovery team worked carefully, collecting bone fragments into labeled bags, preserving fabric, taking soil samples. They were aware that bears could be nearby. A forest ranger stood guard with bear spray and a firearm scanning the trees. The team moved deliberately, speaking only when necessary. Then Dr. Blake found something partially buried near the primary scatter, a damaged plastic license holder. Inside, protected from worse damage by its casing, was a hunting license, issued for 2013. Name: Miles Harrigan. Detective Quinn stood still for a moment, feeling the shift from mystery into fact. This was what everyone wanted and feared at once: confirmation. She made the call to Elena. Elena received it at work, in the library, under the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of paper. She walked into a back room to take it, because some instinct told her this conversation did not belong in public air. Quinn's voice was gentle and direct, avoiding false hope, but also avoiding cruelty. Human remains had been found. A license strongly suggested identity. Formal confirmation would follow. Elena would be contacted about next steps and personal effects. Elena thanked her. Then she sat on the floor, back against a shelf, and pressed her hand over her mouth so no sound would escape. Grief hit like a wave with no warning, the kind that makes your body go weak. It wasn't theatrical. It was simply a collapse of tension she'd been holding for years. After she cried, she felt something else, something she hated herself for. Relief. Not relief that Miles was dead, but relief that the question mark had finally been anchored. The endless gnawing uncertainty had been a wound. Now it would become a scar. In Port Angeles, the news moved fast. People called each other. The outdoor shop put up a small sign on the bulletin board. Miles found. Someone left flowers near the boat launch where he'd often worked. A friend of Miles's father stood on the pier and stared at the water for a long time, hands in pockets, as if waiting for the world to explain itself. But discovery raised new questions that felt more urgent than the old ones. The remains had been found far beyond Miles's expected hunting area, not impossibly far for a healthy man, but far enough that it suggested he had moved, either by choice, by necessity, or because he was lost. Detective Quinn began reconstructing Miles's final trip, starting from this new anchor point. The distance from the parked truck to the recovery site suggested at least 15 miles through difficult terrain, depending on route. Why had he traveled that far? What had pushed him? What had kept him from signaling for help? Dr. Blake's forensic analysis began in earnest at a regional lab, where staff could examine remains under controlled conditions. The bones carried a story, and while bones never tell everything, they do not lie about basic facts. Identity was confirmed through records. Then came the critical finding, a complex fracture to Miles's left leg. The fracture showed signs of partial healing, which meant Miles did not die immediately after the injury. He survived for days after it occurred, possibly longer. The injury was severe enough to make normal walking nearly impossible. Without medical treatment, it would have been agony. It would have increased risk of infection and slowed movement to a crawl. The next findings supported the missing signal mystery. Investigators recovered pieces of a satellite communicator, casing near the site, cracked, fragmented, damaged, as if it had taken a hard impact. The antenna assembly was broken. The battery compartment was compromised. It looked like a device that had been smashed by a fall or slammed against rock. Quinn and Blake worked together to map possible sequences. Miles could have fallen early, crossing a creek, moving through slick terrain, injuring his leg and destroying the communicator. With no ability to call for help, he would have been stranded in one of the wettest environments in the lower 48, entering autumn. People assume hypothermia is a slow freezing. In rainforests, hypothermia can happen while temperatures are above freezing, because wet clothing steals heat relentlessly. A person with an injured leg cannot walk fast enough to stay warm, yet Miles had endured long enough for partial healing. That meant shelter. That meant fire, or at least insulation. That meant will. Analysis of fabric and gear fragments suggested that Miles had made repairs using basic materials from his pack. A belt buckle showed wear consistent with frequent use. A knife handle bore marks that suggested he'd been carving or cutting repeatedly, rather than simply carrying it. Then the recovery team discovered the most personal artifact, preserved in a waterproof pouch, a survival journal. It was not long at first glance. Pages were water-stained, ink smeared in places, but enough remained to read. The first entry was dated October 18th, 2013, 3 days after Miles planned to be home. In that entry, Miles described a fall while crossing a slick log over a creek. He wrote about the sharp snap and the immediate recognition that his leg was badly broken. He wrote about the communicator falling and cracking, refusing to power on afterward. He wrote about trying to splint the leg with branches and tape. He wrote about pain and the sick knowledge that he was alone. The early entries were practical, controlled. Miles wrote about building a low shelter with a tarp, angling it to shed rain. He wrote about keeping matches dry. He wrote about moving only when he had to, because every movement cost him. He wrote about rationing food. He wrote about signals, a fire on a ridge when the rain eased, rocks arranged into unnatural lines, strips of bright fabric tied to branches. He wrote about listening for helicopters that never came close enough for him to be sure. Then, over the next pages, his writing shifted. He described deciding to move along the creek because he believed water would lead to roads. That assumption is often true. It is also sometimes fatally wrong, because creeks can lead deeper into wilderness instead of out. When Quinn plotted the route, it suggested that in trying to follow a logical path, Miles drifted away from the areas searchers expected him to be. Injured and moving slowly, he likely chose the easiest ground valley floors, creek beds, because climbing with a shattered leg would have been impossible. But the easiest ground is not always the ground that leads home. Dr. Blake observed something else in the journal: changes in handwriting. The first 2 weeks remained steady. Letters formed with the same careful pressure. In later entries, lines wavered. Spacing became inconsistent. This could have indicated fever or infection affecting cognition. Yet Miles continued to write methodically, as if the act itself helped him stay anchored. The journal revealed not just survival tactics, but the mental strategies he used. He wrote lists. He noted small goals. He wrote about conserving energy, staying dry, keeping hope alive. He wrote about Elena in spare, direct language that avoided melodrama, thinking of her as a warm room, thinking of her as a reason. In one entry, he wrote about dreaming of the porch light, about hearing the wind in the porch chimes, and waking convinced for a moment that he was home. The last legible entry was dated November 6, 2013. Miles wrote about making one more attempt to move east toward what he believed was a service road. He wrote that he could hear distant sounds sometimes, maybe wind, maybe engines, maybe imagination. He wrote that his leg was swollen and hot, and that he was tired in a way that felt deeper than sleep could fix. He ended the entry with a message meant for Elena, short and devastating. If something happens, tell her I didn't stop trying. The forensic evidence suggested that the fatal encounter happened either that day or the next morning, possibly as Miles broke camp. Bone trauma indicated a large predator attack. The pattern was consistent with a bear encounter that escalated beyond the usual brief defensive charge. In many bear attacks, the animal disengages after neutralizing what it perceives as a threat. Here, evidence suggested prolonged violence and then scavenging over years. Wildlife experts consulted by Quinn noted that black bears near salmon-bearing creeks can be especially protective of food sources, and a sow with cubs is even more likely to react aggressively if surprised. A wounded human moving slowly, unable to move quickly due to a shattered leg, is vulnerable in a way that contradicts everything we like to believe about preparedness. The most painful detail emerged when Quinn compared the journal timeline to search records. The official search had been active while Miles was still alive. He had been in the forest, injured, building shelters, drifting away from the grid, enduring rain and cold. He had survived for nearly 3 weeks, and he had died only days before the organized search concluded. The realization hit the search community like a blow. It meant Miles had been close enough in time that rescue was possible, but far enough in geography that probability never found him. It was the cruel intersection of chance and terrain. Elena received the journal in a sealed evidence copy first, then later, the preserved original pages that could be safely returned. She read them once, in one sitting, and felt like she was walking barefoot through broken glass. Part of her wanted to stop. Part of her needed to know every word, because those words were now the nearest thing to being with him again. After she finished, she sat for a long time with her hands on the table, staring at nothing. She imagined him writing in a dim shelter, rain hammering the tarp, leg throbbing, hands shaking with cold, yet still choosing words carefully so she would understand. That effort communication under despair felt like the purest form of love. In time, Elena made a decision. She could allow the story to remain a private tragedy, or she could let it become a lesson strong enough to save others. With Detective Quinn's guidance and careful redaction of the most graphic details, Elena allowed selected portions of Miles's journal, mostly the practical survival entries and the mental coping strategies, to be used in local wilderness safety courses. She kept the most intimate pages private. Some things belonged only to marriage. She also helped create a small local initiative that began as a fundraiser for SAR training and quickly evolved into a foundation focused on redundancy in backcountry communication. The goal wasn't to sell gadgets, it was to increase odds. 2 devices stored separately, shock-resistant housings, clear check-in schedules, better education about route planning and the dangers of following water without understanding where it leads. Outdoor shops in the region began offering discounts for satellite messengers and backup beacons when purchased together. Guides started requiring clients to share GPS tracks and contingency plans. Hunting partners, even those who loved solitude, began leaving more detailed itineraries with family. For some, Miles's story became a cautionary tale told at counters and campfires. For others, it became something else. Proof that a person can endure more than anyone expects, and that resilience isn't loud. It's small actions repeated: splinting a leg, keeping matches dry, writing in a notebook so you don't feel like a ghost. Detective Quinn officially closed the case in spring 2018, nearly 5 years after Miles had driven into the forest. The final report was long and detailed, covering search metrics, forensic findings, wildlife analysis, and the reconstructed timeline based on the journal. It became a training document for SR coordinators, used not to assign blame, but to highlight how quickly a case can drift outside expectations. A second memorial was held later that year, different from the first. The first had been about absence and unanswered questions. The second was about honoring what was now known. Miles had not simply vanished, he had fought. Friends read brief excerpts from the journal lines about signal fires, about rationing, about hope. People cried openly, not because the words were poetic, but because they were plain in a way that made them impossible to ignore. Elena continued living in their house at the edge of town. She kept the porch light on at night for a long time after the case closed. Eventually, she turned it off without realizing, and when she noticed, she didn't panic. It felt like a small shift from living for his return to living for her own future, carrying him with her rather than waiting for him. She kept his rifle above the fireplace, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who he was: careful, competent, and deeply connected to the world that had taken him. Sometimes, when the rain fell hard enough that the streetlights turned the mist into a silver curtain, Elena would think about the forest. She would remember how it looked from the ridge behind their house, endless green, beautiful and indifferent. She did not hate it. She could not. It was part of the place Miles loved. But she respected it now in a sharper way, the way you respect something that can be both sanctuary and threat. Miles Harrigan's story traveled beyond Port Angeles. Outdoor educators cited it. SAR trainers used it when teaching about search grids and probability. Psychologists teaching survival mindset used the journal entries as case material, not for spectacle, but for the way Miles made sense of time and pain, and for the way love can keep a person assembling small pieces of life even when the future feels impossible. The wilderness didn't change because one man died. It stayed what it had always been: vast, living, and unconcerned with human schedules. But the people did change. Hunters moved more carefully. Photographers carried backups. Hikers told someone where they were going and when they would be back. They bought shock-proof cases. They learned that prepared isn't a badge you wear once. It's a practice you renew again and again, because the forest does not care what you meant to do. And if you listen closely around Port Angeles on a wet October evening, when the wind pushes mist through the cedars and the sound of the water deepens, you'll still hear people speak about Miles. Not as a myth, not as a caution told for drama, but as a man who did what countless others do every year. He went into the woods expecting to come home. He almost did. And the difference between almost and home was a fall, a broken leg, a shattered device, and a handful of miles that no one could see through the trees. The first week after he went missing, the smallest details of Miles's life turned into evidence. The boots by the door looked wrong because they weren't his. The coffee mug on the counter was wrong because it stayed clean. Elena found herself cataloging the house the way a detective might. The fishing gloves still damp from September, a spool of line on the workbench, the old flannel shirt he wore under rain gear folded on a chair. Everything said he had left intending to return. Lieutenant Klein asked Elena to walk him through Miles's routine as if she were narrating a film. What time did he usually wake on hunting mornings? Did he prefer to move ridgelines first, or sit a feed area and wait? Did he mark trails with tape? Did he carry spare socks? Did he ever stash gear in the woods? Elena answered, and then, when the answer didn't feel complete, she answered again with an extra detail she hadn't thought mattered. Miles carried a small roll of electrician's tape because it stuck in rain. Miles liked to camp just off the water so he could listen to the creek at night. Miles hated pushing through alder thickets unless he had to. Miles tended to choose routes that kept him oriented, a ridge to the right, a creek to the left, because he believed the best navigation tool was a mind that didn't panic. Those details shaped the search, but the search had its own brutal logic. Klein divided the area into sections and assigned teams with hasty search tasks, first checking obvious corridors, likely camps, and places a person would go if injured. Then came structured searches with tighter spacing. Volunteers were rotated, so exhaustion wouldn't turn into mistakes. Every team carried radio, first aid, and rescue gear, because in an environment like the Olympics, the line between rescuer and rescued can appear without warning. More than once, that line threatened to blur. On the third day, a volunteer named Travis, an experienced elk hunter, stepped onto what looked like solid ground and felt it drop beneath him. It was an old, washed-out culvert masked by ferns. He fell hard, smashing his shin. It wasn't life-threatening, but it ended his ability to search. When the team carried him out, Elena watched from the edge of the command area and felt her stomach twist. If a careful hunter could vanish and careful searchers could get hurt, what chance did Miles have alone? Another team reported fresh bear sign near a creek, scat packed with berry seeds, claw marks high on a trunk, a smell like wet dog that didn't come from the humans. They pulled back, regrouped, and moved through that stretch with extra caution, calling out loudly. Most black bears avoided groups, but most wasn't enough comfort when every tree looked like a place something could watch you from. A few days in, Klein requested help from canine handlers. Search dogs were brought to the truck. They circled, noses down, tails tense with focus, and then pulled into the woods as if following an invisible thread. But rain diluted scent, and time stretched the trail thin. After a while, the dogs' certainty collapsed into confusion. They circled, tried again, and finally sat, looking up at their handlers, as if asking why the world had stopped making sense. That pattern repeated with technology, too. GPS units plotted tracks, but the forest's terrain forced searchers into detours that made lines messy. Analysts tried to model probability of detection, showing which areas were high likelihood, given Miles's plan. But probability only works when the person does what data expects. A broken leg changes the model. A destroyed device changes it again. Holloway visited Elena after the search scaled back. He sat at her kitchen table, wrote notes, and asked questions that sounded offensively mundane at first. Was he stressed? Any changes in mood? Any unusual purchases? Elena answered with surprising calm, because by that point, her brain seemed to have moved into crisis mode, where it only handled facts. Miles wasn't running from anything. He didn't need to. If he needed solitude, he went into the woods for a weekend and came back. If he needed money, he took another fishing shift. He didn't disappear. He repaired. Holloway asked about medical conditions. Elena told him about the ankle injury the previous year, and about how Miles had been stubborn about seeing doctors, but not reckless. Then she told him something she hadn't told anyone else. On the morning he left, he had stopped at the doorway, turned back, and looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Not dramatic. Just a pause. Like he forgot something? Holloway asked. No, Elena said. Like he was checking that I was okay. That memory haunted her afterward because it was so ordinary. It could have meant nothing. Or it could have been the last quiet moment of connection before the forest took him. Through the winter, Elena's private searches became a kind of ritual. On days when the sky cleared and the snow line pulled back, she went out with a guide named Morgan Hale, a lean, older man who'd spent decades guiding fishermen and hunters through the Peninsula's backcountry. Morgan walked like he belonged to the forest. He could look at a slope and know where water would pool under the leaf litter. He could read the stance of a tree and tell which way the wind usually blew. Elena learned the awkward physical truth of difficult terrain, how quickly a mile becomes a punishment, how every route demands attention, how steady rain drains strength faster than cold does. She learned why search lines had to be careful, and why a person could lie hidden near a trail and never be visible. Once, Morgan stopped and pointed to a shallow depression filled with ferns. "See that?" he said. Elena stared. It looked like nothing. Morgan stepped to the side and showed her the edge of a drop, a narrow slide that led into a ravine. Ferns hid it the way carpet hides a hole in a floor. If you stepped wrong, you'd fall. And if you hit your head, the forest would cover you as quickly as it covered everything else. That was when Elena stopped asking the woods for fairness. The woods didn't know the word. The false lead started in 2015 and continued for years. A backpacker swore he'd seen a man with a limp on the edge of a remote lake. Deputies followed up and found a different hiker. A mushroom picker found an old camp stove half buried and called it in. It belonged to someone else. A hunter recovered a Winchester rifle from a stream bed and thought it might be Miles's. The serial number didn't match. Each lead yanked Elena up into hope and then dropped her back into the same hole. After the third false lead, she began to dread phone calls. Hope stopped feeling like a gift. It felt like being pulled by the shirt toward a cliff. When Detective Quinn took over the file, she met Elena in person, not because she could promise progress, but because she understood that cold cases are still hot to the people living inside them. Quinn didn't say, "Closure." She didn't say, "Move on." She said, "I will treat this like he matters." And Elena heard the difference. After Keating's discovery, Quinn returned to the old search maps with the new location plugged in. Red circles and X marks covered the paper like a rash, evidence of weeks of effort. The new point sat outside the densest portion of the primary grid, close enough to sting, but far enough to explain the miss. It made the tragedy feel like a door that had been closed inches from someone's hand. Quinn interviewed Keating in detail, not only about what he'd discovered, but why he had been there. Keating described his method following animal corridors, looking for sign, moving into places humans rarely entered. Quinn realized grimly that the same features that drew wolves' remoteness, undisturbed corridors, reliable water, were the features that could hide a stranded person for years. The recovery operation took 2 days. The team had to pack remains and evidence out through thick brush to the clearing where the helicopter could lift them. Even with modern equipment, nothing about moving through old forest was easy. Every step was negotiated. Every load was heavier than it should have been because the ground fought back. Dr. Blake's preliminary notes at the scene included observations that would later anchor the reconstruction. There were fragments of tarp. There were knots in cordage that suggested deliberate shelter-making rather than accidental scattering. There were small, careful cuts on branches nearby, not the ragged tears animals make. There were traces of old fire charcoal preserved in damp soil. Signs of a human being choosing to live for one more night. When the journal was dried and stabilized, its contents became the heart of the case. Quinn asked Dr. Blake to estimate how long Miles could have survived, given the injury and the environment. Dr. Blake spoke without drama. "Longer than most people," she said, "because he knew what to do. But the injury changes everything. Pain, infection, limited mobility. It traps you in a shrinking world." Quinn read the journal with gloves on. She'd read hundreds of reports, but this wasn't like those. This was a voice speaking from a place no one had reached. Miles's words were spare, sometimes only a line or two, but each line was loaded with effort. He wrote about days as units. Keep dry, keep water, keep warm, keep mind steady. One entry described his failed attempts to move uphill out of a drainage. He wrote about how every step made his leg feel like it was splitting open. He wrote about resting with his back against a cedar and watching rain drip from the needles, thinking that if he could just get high enough, he could see a landmark, a cut line, anything. Then he wrote about deciding to stop because dizziness was making him reckless. Another entry described hearing something in the distance, possibly a helicopter or a logging truck, and feeling a surge of such sharp hope it made him nauseated. He built a fire anyway, feeding it with wet wood until it smoked, thick and gray. The smoke never brought help. Later, he wrote that he tried to remember that hope could be dangerous if it pushed him to move too fast or too far. He also wrote about boredom. That was what surprised Quinn. People imagined survival as constant drama predators, storms, heroic marches. Miles wrote about long hours of nothing, broken only by pain and the work of staying alive. He wrote about counting raindrops on the tarp and telling himself that if he could keep his mind occupied, panic wouldn't hollow him out. As the entries progressed, the physical details grew starker. Miles described his leg as swollen, hot, and angry. He wrote about infection and a smell he didn't want to describe. He wrote about washing the wound in creek water because he had nothing else. He wrote about fever dreams and waking unsure what day it was until he checked the marks he'd scratched into bark. The crude calendar was recovered near the site, a piece of wood with lines and notches. It was one of the things that made the timeline undeniable. Miles was not only surviving, he was tracking time, measuring himself against the days, refusing to let the forest erase him even before death did. In the last phase of forensic review, wildlife experts offered context for the likely bear encounter. Late October and early November on the peninsula is a complicated season. Food sources concentrate along creeks, and bears that have been feeding heavily are protective and unpredictable. A bear that encounters a human near a food source may react aggressively, not because it wants to kill, but because its instincts interpret the human as a threat. An injured man cannot behave like a healthy man. He cannot back away quickly, cannot climb, cannot sprint. If the first seconds go wrong, everything after them is decided. Dr. Blake's report avoided sensational language, yet did not soften the facts. The trauma suggested a violent encounter that Miles could not escape. But she also pointed to evidence that he tried: a torn strap, a rock cluster that looked like a defensive attempt, the distribution of scattered items suggesting sudden movement. Elena asked Quinn a question many families ask in these cases, and Quinn answered carefully. "Was it fast?" Elena asked. Quinn did not promise mercy. She said, "We believe he didn't have much time." It was the truest comfort she could offer. When Elena finally received Miles's personal effects, there were few items that could be returned. Water, animals, and years had taken most of what mattered, but a few things survived: the notebook, a small pocket compass, a metal spoon, and a ring he kept in his pack. Elena's from their first anniversary, because he said he liked carrying something that reminded him of her. Holding that ring nearly undid her. It felt like proof of his presence, and also proof of how alone he had been when he needed help. Elena's foundation began small, a community fundraiser that paid for extra training for local volunteer SAR teams. Then it expanded into grants for equipment thermal imaging upgrades, better radios, more robust mapping tools. Elena insisted on one specific goal: education about redundancy and injury management. She wanted people to understand that a simple fall can become catastrophic when it removes mobility and communication. She wanted hunters to know how to splint properly, and hikers to know how quickly wet cold can turn not too bad into life-threatening. In the 2 years that followed, several people credited the program with saving them or someone they knew. A teenage hiker broke an ankle and used a backup beacon when his phone died. A solo hunter carried 2 communicators in different places. When one was smashed in a fall, the other worked. A mushroom picker took a wilderness course and later recognized early hypothermia symptoms in a friend, forcing them to stop and build a fire instead of pushing through. Elena never spoke of those outcomes like trophies. She spoke of them like debts being repaid to the universe in small increments. Port Angeles slowly found new rhythms. People still talked about Miles. His name came up on docks and in grocery aisles and at the outdoor shop. Sometimes, when storms hammered the peninsula, someone would say quietly, "This is the kind of weather he was out in." And everyone would fall silent, listening to rain on roofs, imagining a tarp in the dark. Over time, Elena learned to live with the contradiction that Miles's love of wilderness had been both his joy and his end. She learned not to curse the forest, because cursing it didn't bring him back. Instead, she learned to respect it with clearer eyes and to teach that respect to others. There were still nights when she woke from dreams in which he came home late and apologetic, soaked and smiling, and she could smell cedar on his jacket. In those dreams, she scolded him, then hugged him, then woke with her heart racing and the room empty. Grief, she discovered, had seasons too. On the 5th anniversary of his disappearance, Elena went to the edge of the forest behind her house and stood there in the rain. She didn't ask for answers. She simply spoke his name once, softly, and then listened. Water moved through branches. A raven called. Somewhere far off, the creek kept its own schedule. The world remained indifferent, but it also remained beautiful, and that was the hardest truth to accept, that life continues, even when yours has been cut in half. She turned back toward the house, toward the porch light, toward the place where she would keep living, not because she was over it, not because she had moved on, but because she had finally learned that carrying love forward is a different kind of return.